She was standing in the rain at 2 in the morning, barefoot on the cold pavement, holding a garbage bag with everything she owned inside it. She was 22 years old, 3 months pregnant, and the people who had just locked the door behind her were her parents. No neighbor came outside. No car slowed down. Just the sound of rain hitting the asphalt and a young woman trying to decide whether she still had a reason to keep moving forward. What happened next, over the next 7 years, is one of the most quietly devastating and ultimately breathtaking stories you will ever hear. And it is based on real events. Stay with me. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Maya Collins. She grew up in Clarksburg, West Virginia, a small town the kind where everybody knows your middle name, your grandmother's business, and exactly how much your father paid for his truck. It was the kind of place where community meant warmth on good days and suffocation on bad ones. Maya was the second of 3 children born to Gerald and Patricia Collins. Gerald worked shift maintenance at a paper mill 30 minutes outside town. Patricia cleaned rooms at a highway motel 3 days a week and spent the other 4 running the household with military precision. They were not wealthy. But they had pride. And in Clarksburg, pride was treated almost like currency. Maya was not the loudest person in any room. She was the kind of girl who noticed things quietly, the way light hit the creek behind their house in early October, the way certain songs made her chest feel too full, the way words on a page could take you somewhere your body could never go. She kept a journal from the time she was 11. She read everything she could find. By the time she was in high school, her English teacher told her parents she had a genuine gift. She wanted to study journalism. She wanted to tell stories that mattered. She had a plan, and she worked it carefully the way people do when they understand that no safety net is coming. She earned a partial scholarship to West Virginia University and started her freshman year with $12 in her pocket and more determination than most people twice her age. The meeting, 3 to 8 o'clock. She met Ethan Hargrove during the spring semester of her second year. He was quiet about who his family was, and that was actually the thing that made her trust him first. He was not showing off. He was not name-dropping. He sat in the back of a journalism seminar with a worn paperback tucked under his arm and said almost nothing for the first 3 weeks. When he finally spoke during a discussion about media and political accountability, what he said was so precise and honest that Maya turned around and looked at him the way you look at someone when you realize they are more complicated than they first appeared. They started talking after class. Then walking across campus together. Then sitting in the campus diner until it closed. Ethan Hargrove was the son of Governor Raymond Hargrove of West Virginia, one of the most recognized political figures in the state. But he had deliberately chosen a regular dormitory, a regular meal plan, and a campus experience where people knew him as Ethan first and the governor's son second. He was 24, 2 years older than Maya, finishing a political science degree he had started and paused twice due to what he described vaguely as family obligations. He had a kind of heaviness behind his eyes that Maya recognized immediately because she carried something similar, the weight of a life that required constant management. They were different in almost every measurable way. And yet they understood each other in ways that surprised them both. Over the next 8 months, what they built between them felt real. It was not dramatic or performative. It was early morning phone calls and honest arguments and long drives through mountain roads listening to music and talking about everything from childhood wounds to what kind of future felt worth wanting. Maya never forgot for a single day that his family existed in a different world than hers. But Ethan made her feel, consistently, like that distance did not matter to him. She found out she was pregnant in late November of that year. She sat in the bathroom of her dormitory for 40 minutes holding the test before she called Ethan. His voice on the phone was careful, not cold, but careful in a way that told her something was shifting. He said they needed to talk in person. They met that evening at a park bench near the edge of campus. He held her hand. He said the right words. He said they would figure it out together. And Maya believed him because she had no reason yet not to. 3 days later, Ethan's phone went straight to voicemail. Then a week passed. Then 2. She went to his dormitory and was told by a resident advisor that he had withdrawn from the semester due to a family emergency. No forwarding information. Nothing. She emailed. She called. She wrote a letter to the one address she had for him, an apartment he had mentioned once. She heard nothing. And the silence that followed was a particular kind of cruelty, not explosive, not even dramatic, just an absence that grew heavier every morning she woke up to it. She was 10 weeks pregnant, alone in a college dorm, with a partial scholarship that would not survive a medical leave and a future that had just been restructured entirely without her permission. She made the hardest phone call of her life in December, sitting on her dorm room floor with her back against the bed. She called home and told her mother. Patricia Collins did not scream. She went very quiet. Then she said, "Your father is going to need to hear this from you directly." And the way she said it told Maya everything. Gerald Collins was a man who had organized his entire adult life around the idea of respectability. He had grown up poor and had scraped his way into a life where he could hold his head up in public. Maya's situation did not feel to him like a crisis requiring support. It felt like a threat to everything he had spent 30 years protecting. The conversation was short and devastating. He told her that if she was going to bring a child into the world outside of marriage, a child whose father had apparently already vanished, she was not doing it under his roof. Patricia cried throughout the entire conversation but said nothing to contradict her husband. Maya drove home for winter break with the intention of working things out. She left 2 days later with a garbage bag of clothes and the sound of a door locking behind her. Survival, 1800 hours, 30:00. Before we go any further into what happened next, I want to ask you something. If that had been your daughter standing outside in the rain, pregnant, alone, 22 years old, what would you have done? Think about that honestly. Because sometimes we tell ourselves we would act differently, until we are the ones who have to choose between our pride and our child. Leave your thoughts in the comments. This story matters more when we are honest with ourselves about it. Maya spent the first 2 weeks living out of her car, a 2009 Honda Civic with a broken heater and a slow tire leak. She parked in a 24-hour Walmart lot on the edge of town, close enough to use the bathroom facilities and far enough from the main entrance that nobody paid her much attention. She had $412 in her bank account. She got a job at a diner within 10 days, working the early breakfast shift because it was the only opening available. The manager, a no-nonsense woman named Diane who had clearly seen hard circumstances before, let Maya keep a second uniform in the break room without asking too many questions. Small mercies have a way of landing differently when you have nothing. A woman named Ruth Ellison eventually changed everything for Maya in those early months. Ruth was 61, recently widowed, living alone in a 3-bedroom house on the east side of Clarksburg that suddenly felt overwhelming. She had advertised a room for rent on a community board at the diner, and Maya called the number before her shift ended. Ruth charged her $150 a month and frequently forgot to collect it. She cooked extra food and left it on the stove. She never asked intrusive questions, but she listened carefully whenever Maya needed to talk. There are people in this world who show up not with speeches but with soup and an unlocked front door, and Ruth Ellison was one of them. Maya would later say that Ruth is the reason she made it through. 6 months later, in a hospital room with Ruth holding her hand, Maya gave birth to a boy. She named him James. He was 7 pounds, 4 ounces, and he had eyes that, from the very first day, looked startlingly like someone Maya was trying very hard not to think about. She lay in that hospital bed at 22 years old, exhausted and overwhelmed and more alone than she had ever been, and she looked at this small person who had arrived demanding nothing except everything. And she made a decision. Not out loud. Not dramatically. Just quietly, in her own chest. She decided that James would never have cause to feel ashamed of how he came into the world. Whatever that cost her, she would pay it. The next 5 years were not a montage. They were slow and grinding and full of the kind of ordinary difficult that never makes headlines. Maya worked the diner for 2 years, then transitioned to an administrative position at a local health clinic after completing an online certificate program she studied for during James's nap times. She budgeted with the intensity of someone managing a corporation. She bought secondhand, she meal prepped, she drove until her Honda needed repairs she could not afford, and then she walked until she could afford them. James grew into a curious, gentle, funny child who loved dinosaurs and construction vehicles and sitting on Ruth's porch listening to old radio programs she played on a small speaker. Ruth became, in every meaningful way, his grandmother. People in Clarksburg talked, the way people in small towns do. Some were kind. Many were simply curious in that particular way that does not distinguish itself from cruelty. Maya heard things secondhand. A few times she heard things directly, a comment at the grocery store, an implication during a parent meeting at James's preschool. She learned to absorb those moments without reacting. Not because she was not hurt, but because she understood that responding would cost her energy she could not afford to spend. She was building something. Brick by brick, shift by shift, choice by quiet choice. And she did not have the luxury of being distracted by people who had never had to build anything at all. She had not heard from Ethan Hargrove in over 5 years. She had stopped trying to reach him after James turned 1. She had filed for child support through the state, and the case had gone nowhere in ways that suggested someone with resources had made sure it would go nowhere. She did not talk about this publicly. She did not post about it. She worked, raised her son, and let the wound scar over in its own time. But there were nights, and she would not pretend otherwise, when James laughed at something or tilted his head a certain way and she felt a grief that had no clean name. Not for Ethan. For the version of her life that had been quietly removed without her consent. Then, in the spring of James's 6th year, something cracked open publicly that Maya had not expected and had not asked for. A political journalist from Charleston published an investigative piece about Governor Raymond Hargrove's administration, specifically about a pattern of using state legal resources to quietly suppress paternity claims against members of his family and staff. The article was detailed. It named a paralegal inside the governor's office who had described the process. It referenced 3 separate cases over 12 years. It did not name Maya specifically. But it named Ethan Hargrove by first name in a context that caused enough people in Clarksburg to connect the dots that Maya's phone started ringing within 48 hours. She did not speak to journalists immediately. She sat with Ruth at the kitchen table and she thought about it for 3 days. She thought about James, who was 6 years old and did not yet fully understand why he did not have a father in the way some of his classmates did. She thought about what this kind of visibility would cost her, what it would cost her son. She thought about the girls and women in other towns who had similar stories and no one to tell them. She thought about her younger self standing outside in the rain. And then she called a lawyer, a real one, recommended by a legal aid organization she had researched carefully, and she agreed to have her case reviewed for the article's follow-up piece. The response was immediate and enormous. Within 72 hours of the follow-up piece publishing, the story had traveled nationally. Social media amplified it in ways that no one in Clarksburg had the infrastructure to fully process. Maya was described in coverage not as a victim but as a woman who had quietly survived an injustice for 6 years without collapsing, which was accurate. The governor's office issued a statement that said all the wrong things in all the wrong ways and made the story larger. And Ethan Hargrove, who was now working in state policy consulting in Richmond, Virginia, married, it turned out, for 3 years to a woman from a prominent Virginia family, was photographed leaving his office building and said nothing to the cameras except that he had no comment. He showed up in Clarksburg 12 days after the story broke. Not with cameras. Not with security. He called Maya's lawyer first, which her lawyer said was at minimum legally appropriate, and he asked for a private meeting. Maya agreed, on the condition that her lawyer was present and that James was not involved in any initial conversation. They met in a conference room at her lawyer's office on a Tuesday morning. Maya arrived first. She wore a plain blue sweater and no expression that gave anything away. She had rehearsed nothing. She had decided to simply be present and honest and see what he actually had to say. Ethan Hargrove had aged in ways that 6 years will age you when your conscience is carrying something heavy. He sat across from her and he did not make excuses first, which surprised her. He said that when his father's team discovered the pregnancy, he had been given an ultimatum framed as protection, that going public would destroy Maya's life more than his. He said he had been young and frightened and had believed people who wanted him to believe the wrong things. He said he had gotten married while telling himself the chapter was closed, knowing the entire time that it was not. He said he was sorry. Not the public relations version of sorry. The other kind, the kind that does not ask for anything back. And then he asked if he could please, at some point, meet his son. Maya was quiet for a long time. And this is the part one want you to think about. What would you have done? After 6 years of silence, after everything taken from you, after raising a child alone while the person responsible moved on and built a new life, what would you have said in that room? There is no right answer. There is only the truth of what it costs to carry anger forward and what it costs to set it down. Maya said 2 things. She said that she could not promise him forgiveness, that forgiveness was going to take longer than a conference room. And she said that James deserved to know his father, not for Ethan's sake but for James's sake, because children should not inherit the consequences of their parents' failures. Those 2 sentences took more strength than most people will ever have to summon. The months that followed were slow and imperfect in the way real things usually are. There was a formal paternity process. There were legal agreements around financial support and custody arrangement that were fair and documented and enforceable in ways that earlier, informal promises had not been. Ethan began paying retroactive and ongoing child support. Maya used the first substantial payment to relocate herself and James into a house she was renting, with a yard, in a quiet neighborhood. James got his own room for the first time. He picked the color himself, a specific shade of green he described as the color of the forest at noon, and Maya let him. Ruth came to see the room and cried happy tears and then pretended she had allergies. James met Ethan for the first time at a park, neutral ground, with a therapist who specialized in family reunification present nearby in a quiet way. They threw a football for 45 minutes. James asked direct and unembarrassed questions the way 6-year-olds do: why didn't you live with us, and, do you like dinosaurs? And Ethan answered honestly and gently. It was awkward and tender and not resolved in a single afternoon the way movies sometimes suggest. But it was real. And it was a beginning. That mattered more than the neatness of it. Maya went back to school in the fall, enrolled in a part-time journalism program at a state university. The same field she had dreamed about at 20 years old in that dorm room before everything changed. She was 29. She was tired in ways she would probably never fully stop being tired. But she was also someone who had built an entire life under conditions that would have broken many people and had not broken her. The story she wanted to tell, the one about how power quietly reshapes what ordinary people are allowed to have access to justice, she was now living evidence of. And she intended to write it herself. Her parents called 4 months after the story went public. Her father said very little during the call, which was actually more honest than a speech would have been. Her mother cried and apologized in the run-on way people do when they are finally saying something they have held for years. Maya did not slam the door on them. But she did not swing it wide open either. She told them that she and James were doing well and that if they wanted to know them, really know them, that would require time and consistency, not a single phone call. Her father said, quietly, that he understood. It was the most grown thing she had ever heard him say. Here is what this story is really about, underneath the headlines and the legal filings and the dramatic moment in the conference room. It is about the specific and underreported way that systems protect power at the expense of people who do not have it. It is about how a family's pride can do more damage than a stranger's cruelty. It is about a woman who was handed a life she did not choose and built something worth having out of it anyway, not because it was easy or fair or because the right people finally showed up, but because she decided her son deserved a mother who did not quit. And it is about the radical and undervalued act of surviving with your character intact. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself feeling that tightness in your chest at any point, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, did you think Maya should have agreed to let Ethan meet James? Do you think her parents deserved a second chance? And what would you have done, honestly, if you were standing in that rain at 2 in the morning at 22 years old? These are not comfortable questions. But they are important ones. Because stories like Maya's are not rare. They happen in small towns and cities and apartment buildings and college campuses all over this country, and most of them never reach the surface. The women living them simply endure, quietly, and keep going. The least we can do is pay attention. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And share this one if it meant something to you.